So let's look at the first question. Each of the questions, you'll notice, has certain terms underlined. This is something that some competitions utilize. And it's really to help ensure that you pay attention to sort of all parts of the question, that you don't just focus in on a single portion of it. So 300 words. So if you think about this first question, what specific steps does the board take to cultivate and orient new board members and improve the skills and insights of existing board members? That's really three different things that we want to know about in 300 words. How do you cultivate? That means you're out there constantly looking for talent. How do you orient? This means now you have that person, right? You've identified the talent. They've agreed to serve. Now you got the person, but now you have to orient them. And how do you improve? So you got to talk about three different things in 300 words in this first response. So I want to give you just a minute, and I want you to just sort of think in these three categories: cultivate, orient, and improve. And just jot yourself a little note, or just think about it. Either way you want to do it. Think about what you might say about these three things in relation to your charity right now, if you were responding. We're not going to write a 300-word response right now, but if you just thought about it as three categories, how do you currently cultivate new board members? How do you orient new board members? How do you improve the existing board members in terms of their skills and insights? What are some things you might talk about? Just think about it for a moment. You can see already how just the question itself takes you down certain paths, right? In that sense, there's a bit of a philosophical and organizational bias to these questions, in the sense there's a frame of reference that says good boards cultivate new members, right? They don't just wait for people to volunteer. Cultivate is an active verb that says you're actually going out there and you're scouting and you're sort of planting seeds and you're watering and you're cultivating, right? It has a agricultural, horticultural kind of metaphor to it, right? You're caring, you're tending, you're pruning, you're, developing, right? Cultivate, orient, once again, an active verb that says you don't just join a board and show up for a meeting. We actually have a formal or some kind of an orientation process within our organization, that if you want to serve on our board, once we've identified you and you've agreed, we have to have now an orientation, so that when you come to that first board meeting, you're coming having been prepared in some way to participate fully as a board member at that very first meeting with some kind of an orientation. And how do we improve? Right? Once again, an action verb. Improve the skills and insights of existing board members. Right? So these are three different things. And by the fact that we've asked this question, we want all charities in Singapore to be thinking in this kind of a way. What do we do to address these things? So our hunch is that 5 years from now, after we've been running these governance awards for a 5-year period or whatever, right, you have a lot of things that right now are rather rare and episodic, now happening with some degree of predictability and regularity across the sector. So as you look through your own responses, right, this is 1/5 of your overall score, this response. Feeling nervous yet? For some of you, you actually can say things about how you orient people and what you do to improve, but the cultivation part, you're just thinking right now, that's probably kind of weak. Some of you may be thinking about, I don't actually know what the answer to that question is. All right? I need to find out. I need to think about this. Right? In some cases, that's going to lead you on a search for more data, for information. In other cases, you know about the process, but you don't actually know sort of how it works. In some cases, you know about the process, you know how it works, but you don't really know what the result is. Like, how many new board members have you gotten through this cultivation process? Right? And then depending upon what you find, as you sort of think about these three columns, you then have to sort of tailor your response in a way that you hit all 3 points if you can talk about all three things. And if not, you may want to have an internal conversation and decide that as of July, right, we are developing a new process to, whatever. Because, once again, the purpose of the exercise is to, in fact, drive good behaviors, right? I mean, that's why you have these competitions. So in some cases, you're going to say, look, we're a neophyte on this. We're just starting the process. In other cases, you're not. In some cases, maybe the start of your process is you're going to look to visit some charity that's been doing this for some period of time, this aspect, and you want to learn from their process, right? In other cases, you're going to have an internal conversation about it and start working towards this, or you're going to talk to your board about it, or you're going to talk to your board about what their role is in this process. So you're going to, by the end of the month, when this is due, you're going to have figured out what your 300-word statement is of how you do these three things. If you can't do any of it, if you're not doing any of it right now, you're going to be describing where you're beginning right now at the floor. And this might not be true of this question, but it might be true of one of these questions. In other cases, some of you have a well-developed sort of schema you've been using for a while. And others, parts of it's pretty old and parts of it is new. So you're going to describe whatever your state is. The judges are aware. This takes us back to how judges are trying to wrestle with all these things. The judges are aware of the fact that nominees are going to be in different places across these 7 questions, because these are hard questions, right? I mean, we didn't just make these up willy-nilly. These are hard questions. These are difficult things. And they're not happening in most nonprofits globally. Right? I come from the US. Right? Some people think that somehow our nonprofit sector is like way beyond where things are in Singapore. I've served on 35 nonprofit boards. Trust me. All the problems you have, we have too. All the dilemmas and issues, there are struggles everywhere. And there are not only struggles in the nonprofit sector. We had an SGX conference yesterday where we talked about it in terms of corporates and their involvement with the nonprofit sector. But it was a way to also reverse the tables and suggest that nonprofit people should start serving on corporate boards too. That there's things they could learn from the nonprofit sector too. I was bold enough to make that suggestion because I think it's true, that there are things that one could learn from the charity sector on corporate boards. But this issue is a big issue. It's a big issue in charities. It's a big issue in corporate boards too, where corporate boards many times do not have an active cultivation program where they go out really scouting for talent. They go to the proverbial old boys club, which usually is an old boys club, right, looking for talent. Well, that's not really how you cultivate talent. All right, so you're going to think about this some more, and you're going to sometimes, in some cases, have to start a process, and in other cases, you're going to have to dig up some data or some information, further information about how this process actually works. Keeping in mind that at the interview, your CEO and your board chair is going to be maybe asked questions about your response to this item. So you don't want to get ahead of your board either, where you describe a process that sounds totally unrecognizable to that board chair when they're sitting there in the interview session and the judge asks them about some specific question about this cultivation process, and they're like, well, I mean, a good board chair will make something up, perhaps, but and sound reasonably knowledgeable about it. But, the judges we have, I think that would be a dangerous strategy to use, actually. This is a process. And this whole process is a process, right? So as you get involved here in this inaugural year and you're generating responses to these things, you're actually already starting down a new path to some degree with some of these kinds of questions. So if we look at question number 2, this is about benchmarking. What processes does the board use? Notice the question. Does the board, every word in these questions was carefully chosen. What processes does the board use to benchmark its own performance? So this is not about benchmarking the charity. This is about benchmarking the performance of the board. And I can tell you this is something that's rarely done. Right? So we're asking this question because the judges, as we've put these questions together, we're trying to, keeping in mind the code is the floor, right? This is somewhere up on the second story or third story of the building, right? We're trying to build really good charities in Singapore, and benchmarking is a part of that process. So in some cases, the best benchmark you could find might be a corporation. It might be a government agency. You know, in a place like Singapore where the government here is very efficient and, you know, manages all sorts of things, you know, in a very disciplined, rigorous kind of way, it could well be that the benchmark is actually even in a government agency that is looking at these sorts of things and that has these kind of processes in place where they're looking at the performance of their board. So this is about the board, not about the charity. So it's about board initiated, right? It's not just something the charity goes out and does. It's something that's board initiated. The board is really taking ownership of this. It's trying to benchmark itself. It's trying to figure out what really good practices look like at the board level that really improve the functioning of the charity. So this is a tougher one, right? And you might find yourself saying, well, I don't know what we can actually say about that. Sometimes the benchmarking is informal, right? In some cases, you have a formal process. In other cases, they're sort of informal, word of mouth. You talk to, you know, perhaps your board members regularly talk to board members who sit on other charity boards or other corporate boards, or some of them themselves sit on other boards of various kinds. Well, then you're going to describe some kind of an informal sort of benchmarking process. So don't assume right now that just because you don't have a formal process, you can't respond to this question. You likely have some kind of, there's something happening probably at an informal level already. The question then you have to face is whether you want to formalize it more as you move towards the future. But chances are good, I mean, people talk and people serve on boards, and many people who serve on a charity board also serve on some other board or have in the past served on other kinds of boards. Right? So that's a informal process of sort of benchmarking that's perhaps occurring. You have to find out if that's the case, right? You can't just assume that that's the case, but you might want to find out if in fact that is the case, and there's something you can describe then. So you're describing these things, you know, at whatever state they're in right now within your organization. Question 3, what do you use to ensure that the organization's senior leaders, as well as all members of the staff, develop in an ongoing manner their skills and talents in respect to achieving the charity's core purposes? So once again, every word in here has been carefully chosen. So it uses the word all. That means everybody in the organization and how it relates to the core purposes. So let's just take a, you know, this could be a rooftop example, but to what degree do your maintenance people, do your cleaning personnel actually share and see themselves as being part of the vision and the core purpose of what your charity is trying to achieve? This has been looked at in schools in the United States, where it turns out cafeteria workers, janitors, people who clean the building, if you bring them on board and get them on board with the mission of the school, it actually makes a palpable, measurable difference in some of the atmosphere within the school. That they're not just the people who pick up the trash. They actually interact with students all the time. Sometimes in not the nicest of circumstances either, right? And having them on board with what the school is trying to do and having them understand their role within the organization, it turns out, actually matters in a way that many people never stop to consider. Many people, if you ask them the name of the cleaning staff, they're at a total loss. They have no idea who that person is. They don't know a thing about that person. But they're part of the organization, right? And even if they're your contractor, you can name your other contractors. So this is an example where it's about to what degree everybody in the organization knows what the core purposes are, and how is the board ensuring that this sort of is pervasive across the entire organization, that you're developing talent and skills on a continuing basis across the organization. Once again, in any given charity, you're going to have different things you can say and other things where, you're not covering maybe certain aspects of your workforce in as comprehensive a way. So you're going to try to maximize what you can say, but you've got to also keep in mind the question really is this very comprehensive view about everybody within the charity, right? And for your organization, if you're an organization that relies a lot on volunteers, that's a big universe in terms of how that's done. But this is about what the board is doing. Well, the focus of the question is about the board's role, right? So you're going to describe whatever is in fact the case. So if it's framed like that, for example, you want to frame it in such a way that if I am a judge and I'm reading this, I know what that means then when you say the board supports. In that you don't want to just say the word support. You want to use language that tells me specifically what does the board do. Because support, that means anything from people saying, oh yeah, I agree, go and do good, right? To them actually visiting or actually coming, showing up sometimes. Sometimes showing up is half the job, right? Somebody actually showing up sends a message to people. Hey, this matters. The board chair came, or a member of the board showed up at the training we did, or they came to share in a workshop, right? Whatever it happens to be. You have to describe reality. Whatever the reality is, you got to describe it. But you want to think about describing it in a way that when I read it, once again, because the judge does not live in your organization and you can't presume they will know. They will only know what you tell them. And in fact, in part of the facilitation process, my role is to remind them that if they have personal knowledge of this organization, they may even have to recuse themselves from the discussion of that particular charity, right? Depending upon the circumstance, we would have to talk about that. But this is part of the whole facilitation process, right? That's where I earn my keep, right? My job is to make sure that we have a fair, equitable process, and that we're not bringing into it specialized knowledge that is only obtainable because you worked for that organization in the past or because you lived in that organization. So as a board, we're going to, as a panel of judges, we're going to police ourselves about those kinds of issues. So we're going to rely on what you say, how you describe it. So the more specific your language is, the more you're creating an exact understanding for the judges about what your organization is actually doing and what the role of your board is, right? And that ranges from an extreme where the board isn't aware of any of this to the board gets a briefing on it once a year, to the board gets a briefing on it quarterly, to the board actually talks about it at a regular basis on its meetings, to the board is actually, in some cases, perhaps even involved in, visiting some of the actual activity itself. So you have to describe whatever the real nature of the board's engagement is about this issue. And frankly, for many boards, even just to say the board regularly asks questions about it is a move forward. In some organizations, that's a big move forward. Just the fact that the board is asking about what's really happening of all employees who work in the charity in relation to their skills and talent development, in relation to the charity's core purposes. That's what this is linked to. It's not about just personal human development for the sake of development. It's about how is it helping the charity in its core missions. the core purposes for which the charity exists. So these are the kind of questions that, you sort of, when you draft a response, then you want to sometimes use some other people in your organization, perhaps, to read the question first, have them think about the question, and then have them look at the response, right? You want to get feedback from different people about the degree to which you've actually addressed the specific things the question's looking at. Question 4. This is a biggie. It's about the famous conflict of interests and other ethical matters. If you just talk about conflicts of interest, you're ignoring a huge chunk of the universe, right? It's not just about conflicts of interest. It's about other ethical matters related to the work and operations of the charity. Things like fraud, embezzlement. There's criminal behaviors, but then there's other behaviors that are not criminal. They're just unethical. How you might treat some of your suppliers. It's an ethical choice to pay your bills on time. Sometimes if you pay your suppliers late, routinely late, right? This could be unethical behavior. It may not be illegal behavior, but it probably counts as unethical behavior. If it happens once as an accident, that's one thing. But if it happens with regularity, we'd say there's a problem there about you meeting your obligations, right? So this is not just about conflicts of interest, although conflicts of interest is obviously an important one. All right? So this is about the board itself, within the board. This is about senior leaders, and once again, it's that word all, and all employees within the organization who fully do two things. They understand, that's where a lot of training focuses on. Do you understand what an ethical issue is? But then it goes beyond that and says, and makes appropriate decisions. Do you do the right thing when faced with actual situations? So in some cases, organizations do real good about providing some kind of training. In other cases, they provide so-so training. But in some cases, they provide really good training about ethical decision-making, conflicts of interest, sexual harassment, all the sorts of usuals on the list, right? Fair trade practices, fair labor practices, et cetera, harassment, et cetera. But this is about taking it beyond just the training, the awareness, the understanding. It's about also the degree to which you're looking at appropriate decisions that are being made. So one example of response to this might be you have an actual monitoring process in place where you're documenting some of these things as they're occurring, or where you're having debriefs after a situation happens. These could be responses that a charity might have. Once again, like the other questions, there'll be some things where you can have a lot to report and other things where you don't have very much to report. So you just say whatever is the truth. Once again, this is 1/5 of the overall score. 5th, this is about stakeholders, inside and outside the organization. Now, if you're a small organization, right, you have fewer stakeholders. But then in that sense, every stakeholder counts more. Within organizations, if you're a really small organization, there's very few stakeholders inside, but nevertheless you have some. If you're a big organization, of course, you have a lot more you have to contend with. So you talk about what happens on a regular basis. The focus of this is not just what happens once a year, occasionally when somebody mentions it. It's about regularity. Ensuring that such engagements lead to whole board reflection and board action. So this is an example where if you have a good example to actually give, where you actually had an issue, you had information that was collected, it went up to the board spent some time deliberating over it, reflecting on it, and then the board, as a consequence, took some action. That would be something you'd want to describe, because it's an actual example where this process is in place. Now, maybe it was a one-off deal. Hasn't happened since, right? Then you're probably a little weak on the regular part of this question. But nevertheless, you're saying what happened. And at least you got a good example of where this process actually played itself out. Effectively, it led to board action. So it's not just about board reflection, it leads to board action. The board action could be they decided to take no action. But that's still an action. If it's captured in their minutes that they discussed it, they concluded that no further action needed to be taken, that's an action by the board. To agree not to do an action is an action. Number 6, feedback and evaluation of effectiveness as a board from all levels of the organization and from within its constituencies. So this is about getting feedback from others about the performance of the board itself. And you can just ask yourself, how often have you been asked what you think about the board's performance? Right? Good boards regularly get feedback. This is sort of a 360 feedback at the level of the board, where they're getting feedback about their performance from other people. Some boards are really, really good about giving feedback to the CEO about his or her performance, but they're really, really poor about asking people to give feedback about their own performance. And of course, there are worse and better ways of obtaining such feedback, right? I corner you before a meeting and I ask if you have anything to tell me about my board performance. Chances are good, unless I'm an extraordinarily brave person, I'm not going to really tell you the whole truth and nothing but the truth, right? In its unvarnished reality, right? So really good boards that do this, they actually do it independently of the organization. They bring in somebody from the outside and they collect this information. Or it goes to some neutral third party and they cannot trace back, based on the feedback they get, they cannot trace it back to you, to who the individual was who said it. Right? They use third-party evaluation, comes in from the outside, all the data goes to the outside, none of it's collected internally, and then there's organizations somewhere in between. They hire the outside organization, but they give out all the papers inside, and then they collect them all inside, and then they hand them to the organization. Not as good, right? Because then if I'm going around collecting the papers, and if I keep my stack right, I can actually know, I guess they won't be working for us anymore, right? Right. So you have these kind of feedback and evaluation systems. This is looking for systems that really the board has in place to get regular feedback. Once again, keep in mind it says formal and or informal. So for some of you, you can't describe any formal process because there isn't one. So you describe the informal process that actually works. And that usually is sort of a wandering around kind of occasional conversation. Somebody perhaps raises at a board meeting that they were somewhere else and they heard something. These are informal kinds of mechanisms. And then the last question, formal or informal, once again, procedures that the board uses to monitor and improve its public image. This is only 5%, which tells you something about how the judges value this particular one. And like I said, this is really a question about, and in many of these kinds of questions, right, you can't really fully separate, of course, the board from the charity itself, right? These two things are intertwined. But if you're spending too much time burnishing your image, that probably suggests there's other things you're just not paying attention to. Because if you do the other stuff really well, you don't have to worry so much about this one. This one tends to take care of itself. So once again, formal or informal processes. And then this might be an example where an informal process actually is perfectly fine because you're doing really, really well on the other sorts of things you should be doing, and therefore you only need an informal process. It refers to the charity as a whole, but the board being part of that, right? So this is thinking about, because this is the classic case, right? Perception is reality. Whatever the public thinks about your charity, that is reality. It doesn't matter whether it's reality or not. If that's what the perception is, that is reality for the people outside of the organization. All right, have fun, enjoy your journey, And like I say, I think this will well position you as you go towards the future as well, the fact that you've gotten involved and that you've made it thus far in this process. So congratulations, and the best wishes to all of you.